In this lesson, we're going to see how to add types to this endpoint. We created types in a previous lesson for the use course composable. And we can take these and instead move them into this endpoint so that we're able to use those types there. But instead of moving them into the endpoint, we want to be able to use them in this composable as well as in our endpoint. So we're going to create a types folder. Inside that folder, we're going to create a course.ts file. And we'll copy in the types that we have here. We need to make sure to export all of these types so that we can import them into the use course composable. So to do that, we'll add in the export keyword. And then we'll import these types back into the composable. We can do that using this tilde, which references the root of our project. So we do the tilde / types / course. But we actually need to select these specific ones. So we grab lesson, chapter, and course. But now that we're importing these, we need to get rid of the local declaration here. So we can just remove that. And now we've got our types in a separate file. One extra thing that we're going to do to make things a little bit easier for ourselves is create a separate lesson type. One that has the lesson as we get it in the course data, and then one with this path added on. To do that, we'll remove this path property from the lesson type, and then we'll create a new lesson type called lesson with path. And here we can use the TypeScript intersection to take the lesson type and then add on some new properties. In this case, we're only adding on a single property. And what this intersection operator does is it basically just combines the two types together. So going back to use course, we'll also import the lesson with path. And we'll update our composable here to use that. Do lesson with path here. This is technically a lesson, just to be a little bit more explicit and clear in what we're doing here. And we'll also add the chapter type to this one here. It's not strictly necessary, but I like to put it in there just to make it a bit more clear what's going on here. One last thing we need to do is we need to go into this chapter type here. So this lessons property can be an array of lessons, but it can also be an array of this lesson with path. So we'll give this some flexibility here because later on when we go to update our endpoint, we'll need this to work in this way. Now that we've updated these lesson types, I also want to get a little bit fancier with some types and add in a utility type for us. I'm going to put this in a global type file because I don't want to have to import this specifically in each file. And in order to do that with TypeScript, we just need to create a file called global.d.ts. And in that file, we have to export here and then also declare this global namespace. And anything inside this global namespace will be global. And so we're defining a maybe type here. And what this does is it lets us take any other type represented by this T here, and that type could be either T, null, or undefined. And this makes it a little bit easier for us to deal with types where we might have the object or it might be null. So now we need to update the lesson endpoint with all of these new types. So we come over here, we need to first import all of our types. We'll paste in this import for our types. We'll put in this statement which turns our course into a course type. It doesn't actually do anything other than give TypeScript a hint that this object that we've imported is actually of the course type. We'll add the return type as a lesson with path. And then our chapter, we could put chapter here, but the problem is that if we come down here, it will show us this error message. And this message says that we have this whole long thing here, which is basically just telling us the chapter type or undefined. Because TypeScript is smart enough to know that what's returned from this find method could be nothing at all if the chapter was not found. So that's where this maybe type comes in handy. This type is maybe a chapter. And so if we hover over this, we can see that this chapter is indeed a maybe chapter. But then down here, we put this guard up. And so TypeScript knows that this either is a chapter or it's undefined at this point. But we're checking for that case with this if block here. So then now when we come down to this section over here, it's no longer undefined as a possibility. We know for sure that it is a chapter. TypeScript is clever enough to infer that through this logic, at this point in our code, this chapter variable must be of the type chapter because we've already handled that undefined case. And so that's why it's really useful to be able to have this maybe type in there. And we'll do the same for the lesson. Now, if we come down to our return, we can no longer simply return this object because it is of the type lesson. And what we want to return is lesson with path. But that's not a problem for us because we can just add on the path right here. We already know the chapter slug and the lesson slug. And now, because we've added on this property, we've satisfied that type and everything checks out as it should. So if we come back over to Hopscotch, we can test this out. Oh, once I switch over to the get request here, get first lesson, then I'll hit send and we will get our first lesson, but we'll also have the path added onto it. And so why don't I just quickly add in another test here to make sure that we do get that path. Give myself some room here. And we'll check body.path to be, and then we'll just copy in this path because we know that this one is correct. We hit send and we'll come over to our test results pane. And we can see that both of our tests now have passed. So at this point now, we have added our first server route to fetch the data for a specific lesson And we've also added types to that endpoint so that we can make sure that we are fully typed and type safe and leveraging the full benefits of TypeScript. In our next lesson, we will build the endpoint for getting course metadata.